Welcome to part two of the consumer decision-making process or consumer behavior. In the first part, as you know, we talked about the consumer decision-making process and the steps in the consumer decision-making process. Now we're going to talk about all the influences that have on individuals and individuals' personalities as they move through their decision-making process as to what, when, where, and how to buy. At the end of this video lecture, as you know, there will be some discussion questions, so please turn them in to me on Tuesday and Thursday. And without further ado, let's get back to part two of consumer behavior or the consumer decision-making process. Okay, welcome back to Consumer Decision-Making, Chapter 6 here, Marketing 221. So at the beginning of this, the part one of this video lecture talked about the steps in the consumer decision-making process. Need recognition, search, evaluation of alternatives, purchase, and then the post-purchase decision. Now we're going to talk about the factors that affect consumer decision-making and the consumer decision-making journey. And it affects not only what they're going to buy, but also how they're going to buy, when they're going to buy, what they're going to buy, the different products, the brands, etc. And really there's four main categories. There's social factors, there's cultural factors, there's individual factors, and there's psychological factors. So if you look at cultural factors, culture, as you know, is a set of meaning, values, norms, and attitudes. Culture influences a lot of what people buy, what people do, what people wear, etc., and their values. Different cultures have different values, different cultures have different norms and attitudes, which affects the products that they're going to buy, etc. A good example would be, kosher and the Jewish persuasion. So oftentimes with culture it dictates not only how people buy, but what they buy. So the characteristics can be very pervasive, which means the whole culture. Can be functional, which means some part of the culture, some parts do, some parts don't. It can be learned, which means it's handed down, etc. And it could be dynamic. It could be ever-changing. And those are the characteristics of the culture. And then you also have subcultures and social class. Subcultures would be groups of people that share the same elements or the same uniqueness. Whenever I think of subculture, I always think of like the goth subculture, or those people that have a similar hobby, which would be another subculture, like those that say swim in the morning or work out at swimming or something like that. All of those can be subcultures, and those subcultures can really influence what people buy. Brand communities are almost like a subculture, and their brand communities, the two that come to mind is Harley Davidson. Those people that ride Harley Davidsons, that's almost a subculture or a brand community. And the other one would be Jeep owners. Jeep owners tend, the people that own a Jeep tend to have their own subculture or brand community. And then, of course, social class. We know what the social class is. We in the United States don't have as pervasive of a caste system as in other countries, but we still do have our social classes, and those social classes are the capitalist class, which would be the upper echelon, upper middle class. We have middle class, working class, then we have the working class poor, and then we have the underclass, or what we would call the poor. And those are all of the different classes, 1% in the social class, 14% upper middle class. The big one would be the middle and the working class, which would be account for almost 65% of the population here in the United States. And then you've got, the working poor, which accounts for almost 20%. So 15% is really the upper and upper middle. And then it goes down from there. And there's kind of a different definitions of these different social classes there. So social influences are also very, very huge in how, what, and why consumers buy. Consumers seek the opinions of others to reduce their search. Opinions are very important to some people, and they buy based on those opinions. Generally speaking, the Zs and the millennials right now are very influenced by their reference group and opinion leaders. As you age, you become less and less influenced by reference groups and more influenced by family. And if you're very, very young, you're influenced by family. So the big social influence groups are reference groups, opinion leaders. I'm not so sure why it says optional leaders. It should be opinion leaders, and family. So reference group consists of all the formal and informal groups that influence person. Reference groups are your friends, your small inner circle of friends. Reference groups are your classmates. Reference groups can also be your teachers. It can be the people that you work with in your internship or what have you. Primary reference groups includes all the members which you interact with regularly. And secondary membership groups are more formal and people that you don't necessarily interact with on a social basis, but people that you interact with on a formal basis. In some cases, that could be me as your professor. It could be your boss at work. It could be friends of your parents or what have you. Aspirational reference groups are people that you aspire to. Non-aspirational reference groups, I've always called them dissociative groups, are people that we don't want to be like. So we see somebody and say, I never want to be like that. So that becomes a non-aspirational reference group. When you see somebody and say, you know what, I really like that person, I admire them, I'd like to be that way someday, that becomes a aspirational reference group. For marketers, if we know and understand your aspirational reference group, we can use those as a spokesperson for our product. We can use them as a spokesperson in advertisements. We could use them as some type of influencer in order for you to influence the purchase. And it could be an influencer at the point of purchase sales. It could be somebody who's out there doing commercials for you. It also could be somebody like, for instance, One Direction. For younger kids, One Direction is an aspirational reference group, and Pepsi sponsors their tour. So that's a way of having that aspirational reference group promote your product with not really promoting your product by sponsoring. So here's a chart that outlines the different reference groups. Face-to-face would be your primary, your small circle of friends. Secondary in face-to-face would be your large formal groups like your classmates, the people that you go to school with. Indirect, non-membership would be aspirational, people that you want to aspire to be. That could be somebody that your parents know, or it could be a movie star or a sports figure. Non-aspirational is indirect, which you do not want to be. Opinion leaders are people who influence others by opinions. It can be a scientific opinion. It can be that they are in a position of authority, like a president of the United States or a president of a company or something like that. Individuals who influence the opinions of others are what's known as an opinion leader. Marketers look for these types of opinion leaders to help drive product placement, to help drive different products through. And oftentimes it can be challenging. Now, opinion leaders can be just popular people on campus. You know, you get some popular people on campus to try a different product or to be your brand ambassador for a particular product. Then, they can become opinion leaders also. Family is a huge social group. The family is one of the most important social institutions for consumers. It's very strong. It's strong throughout your life. Generally speaking, when you're Zs and millennials, it isn't as strong as when you are young, and then also as you age. The family is responsible for socialization. The family is responsible for rearing. The family is also a huge influencer where people pass down other things to their children. Family members assume a variety of roles such as mentors for people, also as law, really enforcement and other things like that. So the family members have influencers. Generally speaking, when you're young, it's parents. As you age, sometimes it can be siblings. The family also has the purchaser. Generally speaking, when you're young, it's mom and dad. As you age, it will be you. And finally, oftentimes the opinion or the family has the users. And that could be you and your siblings or just you or what have you. Marketers consider the entire family unit as they are looking to advertise, as they're looking to drive products, and as they're looking to drive pricing and different sizes like that. For instance, if you look at Coca-Cola products, there's family packs out there and there's individual packs and things like that. And all of that goes to the family and how the family influences the purchases of different products. There's also individual differences that make people suspect to different influences and different consumer decision making. Not all people are equally influenced, but depending on whether you have an internal or an external locus of control, and obviously that's a term that you learned in organizational behavior. Whether you have a separated self-schema or a connected self-schema, as you see yourself as part of an integral group or you see yourself separate, whether you want to be part of the group, whether you want to be separate, stand alone from the group, or in certain instances you want to set yourself apart or be part of the group. So individual differences, just really attitudes and your locus of control and your self-schema are all huge influences on your buying decisions. Gender is also a huge influence, not only on what you buy, obviously clothes and some of those other things, but purchases that are gender non-specific. Different genders purchase differently. There are psychological, physiological differences between men and women. And obviously, not all men are created equal and not all women are created equal. But gender is a very important influence on consumer decision. For instance, generally speaking, the woman is the one that takes care of the household for household finances, does the purchasing for the household, plans the meal, buys the personal products like soaps and things like that, and also does shopping for clothes and school clothes for the child. Age and family life cycle are also a big influencer. You have consumers' age. Obviously, someone who has children that are very young are going to purchase differently than those that have children that are, say, in high school and they're saving for college. And then empty nesters are going to purchase differently. So depending on where you are in the life cycle, you've got different purchases. Whether you're a single parent, whether you're a multi-parent household, or a dual parent household also has a big influence. And then people's careers, where they are in their career. So their family life cycle, not only within the family, but also within their careers, have a big influence. And then, of course, life-changing events occur at any time, and that also can have a huge factor on consumer decision and consumer buying behavior. So personality and self-concept also has a huge influence on what you purchase and the way you purchase. Self-concept or self-perception is how you perceive yourself. And more importantly, well, just as important as how you perceive yourself is how you want others to perceive you. Self-concept combines the ideal of self-image, the way the individual would like to be perceived, and the real self-image, the way an individual actually perceives him or herself. So that's self-concept, which has a major influence. Then finally, perception, how you perceive things, your personal bias. You have selective exposure, which means oftentimes you filter out and you just hear what you want to hear. Or you hear things the way you want to hear them. Oftentimes you put a personal bias within a message or something like that. And we'll talk about that when we get to the communication process. Selective distortion is deciding which stimuli to notice, which to ignore. And selective retention is the same thing, only which stimuli to retain and which ones not. Marketers use perception to try to influence purchase decisions. For instance, price. $19.99 sounds a lot cheaper than $20. So they use price and they use end pricing, 99, etc., in order to do perception. Brand names. Nike is perceived as an athletic apparel, a high quality athletic apparel. Apple iPhone is perceived by millennials and Z as being the best cell phone out there. And that's perception based on quality and reliability. So there's perception or just noticeable difference. Just noticeable difference is when there's product parity. Perception is when someone actually perceives that the product is better or worse. And the way a product is positioned also has a lot to do with perception. For instance, I've said this in the past, what's the difference between a Mercedes-Benz and a Ford Fusion? Other than the fact that it's $60,000, many people perceive a Mercedes-Benz as being high quality, higher class, and a higher class of drivers drive a Mercedes-Benz versus, say, a Ford Fusion. And then your level of motivation has a huge, huge factor. If you're motivated to look a certain way, if you're motivated to act a certain way, if you're motivated to be in a certain club or group or what have you, will certainly have a high influence on your particular buying habits. And as I started out this lecture, when we talked about needs and when we talked about wants, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, physiological being the first one, self-esteem being close to the top, and then self-actualization, development of needs being the highest one. And I'm not going to go into Maslow right now because you've studied Maslow a lot. So that concludes our video lecture for Chapter 6 on consumer behavior and buying decisions. Here are your discussion questions. Please finish these discussion questions and hand them in to me on either Tuesday or Thursday, depending on your class time. And until then, I look forward to seeing you either Tuesday or Thursday.